Hi and welcome to the Financial Fox. Today on the show we have again Charles Hoskinson, founder of Cardano and the CEO of Input and Output Hong Kong. So Charles, how are you?
I'm feeling great. It's always fun to talk to you guys.
Great. So today we would like to talk a little bit more in detail about Facebook global cryptocurrency. I mean, in June, Facebook made the official announcement it is entering the cryptocurrency market with the launch of Libra. What was your reaction to it?
Well, it's a mixed bag. On one hand, Facebook doesn't have a very good record of decentralizing things and giving power to the users. They, like most Silicon Valley companies, are a middleman of necessity, and occupying that position have an enormous amount of control over your privacy, your information, and your autonomy. And they kind of like being dictators in that respect. On the other hand, Libra, like any other token, is going to bring people into the cryptocurrency space and make them aware of fundamental concepts like wallets and public-private key pairs and basically being able to control their own funds. So the fact that a 2+ billion person platform is now creating this payment system and currency is going to be very good long-term for our space. It's going to invite tough regulatory questions. It's going to create an opening for other people to enter the space. So for example, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, these other guys who are sitting on the sidelines kind of waiting to see what happens. It's almost analogous to self-driving cars. Everybody knew they were coming. Every car company had a research group, but it wasn't until Tesla had the courage to go and make that move that it proved to the rest of the market that you could do that, not get sued out of existence or regulated out of existence. And so now my Cadillac drives itself. There's tons of other cars that are moving down that road. So similarly, the existence of Facebook in the market will be an invitation to other platform providers to come in, and it's kind of the next wave. And it's also a great competitive pressure on the incumbents in the space, like the Cardanos, the Ethereums, the Bitcoins, to evolve more quickly. Ultimately, this is Darwinian technology. It's survival of the fittest. And we have to be obsessed with usability, consumer experiences, and usefulness in order to survive. It's frustrating from one perspective because, of course, Facebook has certain advantages that we don't enjoy. They have tons of lobbyists, and they can perhaps get regulation pushed in a way to give them an advantage, and they already have a platform effect of billions of people. On the other hand, by bringing these billions of people into the space, that means those are potential customers for us as well, because we can make a better philosophical argument that what we're doing is a good thing. And then finally, we'll force the question of regulatory clarity. So long-term, a good thing, short-term, a chaotic thing, midterm, a Darwinian thing. It's going to force a lot of really interesting conversations and fights and kill a few things, create a few new things.
That's a very interesting answer. I mean, some detractors, they basically arguing that Libra was not actually a real cryptocurrency because it was going against all the principle of the crypto world, particularly about decentralization and, the power that a company like Facebook will still have on the data, for example, and also the power of big tech. Do you think this is true? Do you think actually Libra is going to be successful? What's your views?
Well, whether Libra is successful or not, these massive platform providers will eventually enter the space. The Samsungs, the Microsoft, the Apples, the Googles, and at least one of them will achieve some degree of market success. It's hard to say, whether the Zune wins or the iPod wins or these things until after it happens, and then people always say it was self-evident, but it's never clear, right? At one time, Microsoft had 95% of all computing devices under its claws, and now 95% of all computing devices don't run Microsoft software, and that was just 20 years. So things change very quickly, and and that's what makes technology fun to be an entrepreneur in, because you never get bored. That said, you have to always ask yourself foundational questions of what does this do for the industry? And what's nice about Libra is you don't really have a philosophical debate about who you are and your positions in times of no crisis or peace or no competition. You just implicitly go along with it, and you don't really self-reflect. You'll only have the philosophical debate about your faith or what you believe in when an alternative vision comes in and it starts, tempting you to follow it. So if somebody comes in and it says, I have this system that's 10 times faster and it has instant settlement and it's much easier to use than the system you have, then you start asking, well, why am I on the system I'm on? Is it because it's the only shop in town and I don't really care at all about ethics or philosophy of the space? Or is it because I'm philosophically invested in this? Then you really have to ask yourself, what is the nature of decentralization? What is the nature of control? Should transactions always be immutable and irreversible? Or should there be cases where your money can be frozen and reversed and so forth? And in a way, we're having kind of now a global conversation about that for the next world money system. The system we currently have, all those choices were made for us by people who are dead or in diapers that we probably never met. And we just accept it as a fact of life. Now, it's the first time in human history where we actually do get to vote with our feet. We get to decide the financial system we want to live within and the ethics of that system, the philosophy of that system, and nothing is free. So the more philosophically pure the system happens to be, something has to suffer. Usability, liquidity, ease of access, ease of acquisition, perhaps regulatory problems, whatever it might be. But it may completely align with our ethics and our belief of what good money happens to be. And there's probably going to be enough people in it that you can find a way to thrive and survive within it. And if you don't care, you have no ethical core, you're just, like the Beatles, Mr. Nobody, then, you can go and live with Libra. That's the Mr. Nobody platform. And the point is, we've never had a time in human history where we have a marketplace for ideas like this. It's just been decided for us, so it was never an issue. Now the free market and the people who occupy the free market have an additional consideration above and beyond price, an additional consideration above and beyond usability. It's a philosophical consideration for yourself, for your children, and for your society. And we'll see real time where it goes and how it works out. I think it'll be a heterogeneous where no one's going to win. It's going to be actually an internet of value and an internet of blockchains. And there's going to be all these smaller, more philosophically, more principled systems that are self-sustaining.
How about the concern about data privacy?
Well, that's a bigger conversation above and beyond just Facebook. The problem is that nobody on the political side anticipated we'd live in a world of big data and predictive analytics. Nobody realized that cost of storage would get so low, and because of a highly networked world, everything about who we are and how we interact with people has the potential to be logged, aggregated, and put into a profile. And then with a predictive analytics stack put on top of that, you would be able to then ask meaningful questions about us, ranging from what products we prefer to who we would vote for to whether we're a threat to the state or not. So given that we now live in this beautiful and dystopian reality at the same time, beautiful in that this can solve huge problems, like, for example, allow us to finally get political certainty on where people want to go. So it's a much better way of handling democracy, allowing people to build better products, to being with genomic data and medical data, be able to solve diseases we never thought we could cure, like cancer. So that's the beautiful component. But the dystopian component is tyrants now have a much better toolbox than even the Stasi or the KGB had in years past. And that toolbox can be used to preserve political power. And we're seeing that in China right now with social credit. So there's a global conversation about who owns your data and what rights do you have. We see this with GDPR. We see this with G20 mandates. We see this with all kinds of organizations like the EFF making recommendations. But ultimately, it stems down to the aggregation points, the platforms that create the data, that aggregate the data, that refine it. And then it's about the ownership and who can they share that with. So the Facebooks, the Googles, the Microsoft, the Amazons, they have windows into your life you never thought possible, and you gave it to them because they didn't explicitly tell you probably the consequences of it, and you liked what you got back. Free internet searches, the ability to connect with all your friends and family and have great interactions with them, products that are relevant to you at a cheaper price, more usable computer systems. And so now the burden is on society to constrain their behavior through regulation and through marketplaces. And so what's occurring is alternatives are forming. Identity alternative standards like self-sovereign identities, so that's called the DID standard, for example, decentralized identifiers. So that's one dimension. regulation behind the right to be forgotten, trusted hardware enclaves where when you share something with somebody, you can get a guarantee that when you don't want them to have that anymore, you can erase it and they can't see it anymore. Changes to compliance where organizations don't have to store information about you for 7 years or 10 years or things like that. It's a huge conversation. And the blockchain space actually has a bag of tools that are new that it brings to the space to help that conversation along. But it's not just our provenance, our industry. It's actually everybody's problem. And this is one of the great challenges of the 21st century. There's several. There's the rise of things like CRISPR, which are going to bring fundamental questions of what it means to be human, and is it ethical to change that? There's the rise of AI, which means we could end up creating life that is beyond us. And then what does that mean for society? And then there's the data question. And the data questions about now we have the chance to have godlike knowledge of everything and be able to put godlike prediction on everything. And eventually we will start making decisions about who's good, who's bad, who gets to play, who doesn't get to play based upon that knowledge. And how does society navigate that? You cannot solve this with just one model or one thought or one group of people. You solve it through a collective conversation, trial and error, struggle, making mistakes, and perhaps even wars. And then after you go through all of it, the world reaches a new collective governance system. It reaches a new collective narrative on how to deal with these things, and you move on. But these are the challenges of our time. In the 20th century, we had different challenges. We had the rise of nuclear weapons. We had the rise of communism, and what was that going to do for the world? We had totalitarianism and fascism during the 1930s and 40s. And so every generation has its challenges. In the 14th century, the human race nearly went extinct in Europe because of the Black Death. So, it's our time, and we're just working our way through it as a society, and I'm an optimist. I honestly believe we'll find a way to get through it.
I mean, one of the things I would like to pick up your brain on is Libra mission is very similar to Cardano mission, which is basically providing financial services payments to developing nation and to the unbanked. I mean, we know that Facebook, a leader in the social media space, has great users in Africa. WhatsApp, biggest market is in India. Do you see Libra as a competitor of Cardano?
No, because there's so many other things you have to do to actually get into the developing world. If it was as simple as building a relationship with somebody and having a payment channel, it would have already been solved. These are super complicated problems because they're multivariate. You have to have cash in, cash out points. You have to have the regulation in the right place. You actually have to have stable markets. You actually have to have a whole ecosystem around what you've proposed. And the problem is Facebook is an American company, and all they've done is just basically taken an instrument and back it with the dollar and, build a payment system on top of that. It's like, okay, that's one component. And yes, you'll have value stability, and yes, you'll have fast transactions, and yes, the customers will know you. But there's so much other stuff that has to happen for an economy to form. That's why we have a totally different strategy. So look at Africa, look at Ethiopia, for example. There are 15 million smallholder farmers in Ethiopia, 3 million of which live on less than a hectare of land and make less than $2 a day. They're not really thinking about Facebook token versus Ether token versus Bitcoin. They're thinking about, how do I sell my coffee that I produce? So a much more meaningful solution to get them banked is actually a supply chain system that gives them better market access. And then once that's constructed, they're not thinking in terms of dollars or financial instruments. They're thinking in terms of commodities and labor. And the fact that you can tokenize these aspects and actually allow them to get liquidity with these types of things and then use that liquidity to get the necessities of life and thrive is actually the key. Now, is Facebook sitting there figuring out how to build coffee supply chains with Libra? No,
this
not
is
in their scope.
This is what you basically mentioned in one of your comments. You mentioned about relationship-based markets, which, this kind of relationship that Cardano has been developing over years and Facebook doesn't have.
Right. All they have is the platform that people live on. And so in some ways, perhaps they actually are complementary.
Yeah.
Where, ADA, for example, is not a value stable currency. It's an infrastructure token to hold up this big piece of infrastructure. And at some point, people will deploy their own assets. Those can be security tokens, those can be utility tokens, or those can be currencies. And they can be value backed. And they could even be sovereign issued. For example, we're right now negotiating to build a currency in Ethiopia for the Ethiopian government for utility payments. That very well could turn into a local currency that could be used for products and services, just like M-Pesa has. And the fact that it has cash in, cash out, government legitimacy would probably make it a significantly more competitive product than Libra would be. The other thing is that there's going to be a lot of these Libras. As I said, Microsoft will probably get in, Apple will probably get in, and so forth, because they want to disintermediate their payment providers. They don't want to pay the credit card companies money. They think about value leaking out every time something happens, and you don't want 10% of your revenue going away to middlemen that you don't need. You'd rather just vertically integrate and have total control over the entire stack. So they're thinking about, frankly, different world. If Facebook wants to use the developing world in marketing, I'd love to ask them why we've never seen them in Ethiopia. I'd love to ask them why they haven't built real infrastructure there other than just training a few developers in Nigeria and having them do some stuff. And I'd love to ask them why they're not trying to solve the actual problems that are on the ground. These people don't need payment systems. They need much more fundamental things. They need market access. They need the ability to prove that the things that they're doing are legitimate. They need credentials that mean something. They need good, high-paying jobs. These types of things. These are foundational problems. And blockchain actually can have something to say about each of these particular types of problems. You solve those, you've built wealth. You've built relationships. You've built progress. And then they become great consumers. And then they need more diverse financial products and better marketplaces and better payment systems and so forth. But it's just starting with a token that's worth $1, and then because you happen to have them in your infrastructure, saying that this will in some way solve all their problems. It's naivety at its highest level, and it's a fundamental misunderstanding of why the world works the way it does and why certain countries haven't been as successful as other countries. It's systemic problems, and they're multivariate.
Thank you very much, Charles, for your comment on Libra. And we will be back with the third episode of your interview next week. So stay tuned.